We have to have a very tough policy, otherwise you have millions and millions of people pouring into our country. We can't have that. We have no choice. We have to have a very strong border. If we don't, you'll have millions and millions of people. It'll look, what's happening today, look like child's play. It'll be a terrible thing if we ever did that. So we have to be very, very strong on the border. If we don't do it, you will be inundated with people, and you really won't have a country anymore. You know, without borders, you don't have a country. I've said it for a long time. Mexico, by the way, is doing nothing for us. Nothing. They have the strongest immigration laws. They can do whatever they want. They can keep people out of Mexico. You have a 2,000-mile journey up Mexico. They walk through Mexico like it's walking through Central Park. It's ridiculous. They encourage people, frankly, to walk through Mexico and go into the United States because they're drug traffickers, they're human traffickers, they're coyotes. I mean, we're getting some real beauties. Mexico is doing nothing for us except taking our money and sending us drugs.
What?
Yeah, my God.
I really, I don't know where to start. This is now, in the past 2 weeks, you have the President of the United States bashing our neighbor to the north, Canada, and then coming up with the fruitiest, most bizarre, sounding like a senile guy in a rest home screaming at a television turned off, saying that Canadians scuff up shoes and smuggle them northward and try to sell them again. Seriously. Grandpa Simpson doesn't even say his bizarre things on The Simpsons in all the seasons. And now he's attacking Mexico to the south, who, by the way, just for the information of our viewers, has roughly the same GDP as Russia. And so here we are, Willie, blessed with neighbors to the north and the south, with the longest stretch of demilitarized borders, north and south, as any country on the planet. And Donald Trump is going out of his way, insulting our most important geographic allies.
You go watch that clip again, there's real venom in his voice. This, as you peel back the curtain, this is how he feels. These are his deeply held beliefs about Mexico. These are his deeply held beliefs about people who come up from south of the border. This is not one of his riffs or his rants where he's sort of making it up as he goes. We heard it the first day of his campaign, the first line of his speech when he came down the escalator 3 years ago. This is what he thinks. And you know what, John, Steve Ratner was here 2 days ago with his charts showing us that apprehensions at the border remain near historic lows.
Yeah.
And so Donald Trump is painting this picture of an invasion from the south, of an easy walk up through Central Park. And I think if you ask some of the people we've been interviewing at the border this week, the women who've come with their small children to escape gangs or pulled their sons out of a gang or their daughters out of harm's way from a gang, they're not going on a walk through the park. They're risking their lives for a better life to get out of there. That doesn't mean some of them aren't breaking the law and we shouldn't handle them. But my God, this picture he's painting just isn't supported by fact.
Yeah, well, to your first point, you know, it is interesting, as Joe said, that he's antagonized the Canadians and antagonized the Mexicans, and the difference in tone is striking.
Yes.
And points to, when you peel back the curtain, as you said, to the racism of it, because he gets mad at Justin Trudeau because Justin Trudeau is impertinent in his view, and he slams the Canadians, but there's no anger, harshness, viciousness to it. When he talks about the Mexicans from the very beginning until now, he talks about them with this kind of, it's Grandpa Simpson meets Archie Bunker. It's this lace-through kind of racism, and I'll say one other thing about it, which is just, you know, I grew up in Los Angeles and a huge Hispanic population there. I spent a lot of time in my youth schlepping back and forth to Tijuana. I've been in Mexico dozens of times in my life.
Oh boy!
And then the reality of what these people go through, whatever you think about your policy prescriptions are about immigration, border control, et cetera, et cetera. The reason that many of these people come is because they are facing horrible life circumstances, violence, crime, terrible circumstances that they are fleeing from, and the journey they are making is, as you said, not just not a walk in Central Park, but is a harrowing, life-threatening, a thing that is deeply considered by these mothers and fathers who bring their children full well knowing the risk to themselves and their kids because it is still a better option for them than what they face in their domestic circumstances. But they are making fully calibrated, calculated life decisions here, understanding the risks, and the risks are huge.
John, along those lines, it is no different. I think we have to start thinking of it this way, is when Jews and Christians were fleeing the Nazis.
Yeah.
They were leaving, when these people are leaving Guatemala, when these people are leaving El Salvador, it's to keep their daughters from being sex slaves. They are fleeing. There's no, it would be if we was the early 1940s or the late 1930s, and we had people coming from Eastern Europe because they didn't want to be killed. They didn't want to be put in ovens. And we said, no, it's not who we are. You guys are going to infest our country. There is no difference. So if your family came from anywhere decades ago to escape, whether it was from the Russians or the Nazis or anyone else, it is no different. Yes, they are brown. And yes, maybe they speak a different language. It is no different.
If you think there's a difference between saying and doing something, well, he's saying it and he's doing it now with these children at the border.
I've just said before, the moment when he said last week, when he used the phrase infest, it was the moment when it was clear to anyone with ears to hear that he regards brown people as vermin. That is the language of, it's the language of exactly this thing. I never like to go to the Nazi analogies, but when you start talking about a class of people as being the source of an infestation, you are talking about people as if they are subhuman. You are talking about them as pests.
We have to draw that
termites.
line. We have to draw a very
vermin. That is
firm
what he feels. That is what his language conveys. You just have to hear it. It's all there.
And Joe mentioned his comments about Canada the other day. Let's take a look at those right now.
And by the way, Canada, they like to talk. They're our great neighbor. They fought World War II with us. We appreciate it. They fought World War I with us, and we appreciate it, but we're protecting each other. There was a story 2 days ago in a major newspaper talking about people living in Canada coming into the United States and smuggling things back into Canada because the tariffs are so massive. The tariffs to get common items back into Canada are so high that they have to smuggle them in. They buy shoes and they wear them. They scuff them up. They make them sound old or look old. No, we're treated horribly. We can no longer be the stupid country. We want to be the smart country.
Well, if we don't want to be the stupid country, then we may want to consider who speaks for us. Because Jonathan Lemire, a couple of things. First of all, certainly under Barack Obama, we had a trend, a negative trend at the border, actually, of immigration. People were going back to Mexico. And so Donald Trump, when he talks about Mexico, says millions and millions of people would be flooding in. No, in the last years of Barack Obama's presidency, they were going back to Mexico. There was a negative net flow when it had to do with illegal immigration. So if it's so bad now, then my God, why is Donald Trump? Maybe they see him as a feckless, weak leader. I don't understand that. Secondly, you see what he just did? It was remarkable. He dismissed Canadians fighting and dying with us on the beaches of Normandy. But said, hey, they're scuffing up their shoes, so he said they will sound old. It's really, these are the times when it is impossible to dissect what the President of the United States is saying, because, to borrow his language, it just sounds so stupid.
And that story in the major newspaper that he mentions there is a column in the New York Post about one anecdote, which he is then using to make this larger point. But as has been discussed here at the table, he's at least making the argument about Canada in sort of, he's framing it in as flawed as it is, economic terms, and he does it differently when it's with Mexico. It does have a much harder edge to it. And I'd like to pair the comments we heard him say yesterday in that meeting at the White House with his remarks from the rally in Minnesota a couple nights ago, where he invoked his kickoff speech at Trump Tower, which was 3 years ago this week, in which he said that Mexico was not sending their best. He brought that back in that rally in Duluth, which the executive order that he signed this week to reverse himself was mentioned once in that speech. It's something that he clearly tried to gloss over, tried to move past, and then spent minutes after minutes sort of with thunderous rhetoric talking about how hard line he is still on immigration, as if he was still trying to prove himself to the crowd. This is who I still am. This is still my identity. This is why you elected me. This is why I've been saying this is a good issue for Republicans this fall, as poorly as that polls, but that's what his instinct is saying, and he doesn't have advisors around him to steer him otherwise, that this is still who he is. Yes, it's a rare reversal for this president to back down on anything, particularly with immigration. We saw that this week, not for a moral reason, but because the PR was so bad, the optics were so overwhelming, he had no choice. But in his heart, in his seriousness of his policies, his immigration, it is this. It is hawk, it is this hardline rhetoric, and it's not going away. And that crowd in Minnesota ate it up.
So, Yamiche, I'm just wondering, we know about some of these people, but Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Kristen Nielsen, Jeff Sessions, Ivanka Trump, and obviously Stephen Miller, how will they be remembered as anything but the people who put forward an un-American, cruel policy that was abusive to small children?
I mean, I think that overall, this is a White House that is still, I think, led and focused on Donald Trump's version of policy and Donald Trump's version of immigration. So all of these people, I think, do have their own beliefs in this policy and in the idea that President Trump puts forward. But I think it's clear that the president, there was something that someone that said this president kind of is now reigniting what he said when he kicked off his campaign. I venture to say that he never let that go, that he has always governed that way. He's always talked that way. He's always surrounded himself with people that believe that. There's a lot of talk about the influence of Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, but they weren't standing next to him when he launched his campaign calling Mexicans rapists and criminals. So I think that the people that are surrounding Donald Trump are just influencing him and really in a way that's really just like doubling down on what he already believes. And I think I just want to add, when I was in Minnesota, there's this idea that all of these officials are able to say one thing and then switch it off really quickly. The supporters of Donald Trump believe in his alternative facts. The people that I talked to when I was trying to ask them about the policy, they were just regurgitating everything from Donald Trump's tweets. They said that we love the fact that he's tweeting and speaking directly to us. So when we can play these videos of Jeff Sessions saying one thing and then saying another, but his supporters believe him they believe everything that he's tweeting, and as a result, that's why the media reporting doesn't really get through in the same way.
So coming up, with the president's comments about our allies as a backdrop, consider this. The Trump administration is pressing ahead with plans for a summit with Vladimir Putin next month, despite the intelligence assessment that Russia is still meddling in U.S. politics. Mike Allen joins us with more on Trump's summer tests next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.